With there now being a plethora of games to have adorned the Final Fantasy name, one of the more popular misconceptions is that each successive title is a sequel to the ones that came before. However, contrary to this surprisingly popular belief, very few games in the franchise are actually direct sequels to other games. Final Fantasy X was the first title to get a video game sequel in Final Fantasy X-2. However, it was not the first Final Fantasy to get a sequel altogether. Final Fantasy V had that honour with Final Fantasy Legends of the Crystal, a 4-episode anime released in 1994, and amusingly, that anime was actually released in North America before the game itself. Now, after the success of Final Fantasy X-2's release, Square Enix began to develop numerous other direct sequels to existing Final Fantasy games across all different types of media formats, expanding on the worlds of beloved titles like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy Tactics. But there are many more sequels that are largely unknown by the fanbase at large, and this could be due to them not having a worldwide release, or simply because they just flew under the radar. It's those sequels that we're going to be running through in today's video, as we hope to illuminate games that even the die-hard fans may not have heard of. But to keep things neat and tidy, we'll only be talking about games specifically, as there are a lot of sequels present in other mediums, such as Final Fantasy VII's On the Way to a Smile. And we've also chosen to exclude some games like Chocobo Anywhere 2.5 Infiltration Ancient Ruin, because they're essentially lost pieces of media and there's very little available online anymore about them. But the Chocobo franchise is still a good place to start, and our first sequel relates to that lovable mascot. Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo's Tales, which was released on the Nintendo DS in 2006, starred the eponymous Chocobo, who went on a quest to save its friends from an evil storybook, which absorbed them into various children's stories. A big part of the charm of Chocobo's Tales was therefore in the stories themselves, as they were drawn from well-known children's tales like Grimm's Fairy Tales and Aesop's Fables. But they had a Final Fantasy twist. For example, where you would have the tortoise and the hare, instead you'd have the adamantoise and the cactuar. In terms of the gameplay, players collected cards based on popular Final Fantasy monsters and summons in order to battle opponents, and they could participate in various minigames in order to free the Chocobo's friends from being turned into cards themselves. The simple and light-hearted nature of Chocobo's Tales led to positive reviews from critics, and despite being aimed at a younger audience, many Final Fantasy fans enjoyed the blend of popular culture and references from across the series. This then prompted the creation of a sequel called Chocobo and the Magic Book: The Witch, the Girl, and the Five Heroes. Released solely in Japan in 2008, Chocobo's Tales 2 expanded upon the original, seeing the Chocobo travel to Million Islands to help Sid, the writer of the picture books, and thwart the efforts of the witch, who wanted to remove the happy endings from all the stories. Chocobo Tales 2 also introduced new minigames, now largely rendered in 3D, as well as new pullback jewels. And card collection was still very much a part of the game, with multiplayer even introduced so players could battle against each other. These were all positive moves, but upon release, Chocobo Tales 2 did not find an audience, and it ended up selling less than half of the original game. It's perhaps for this reason that the game was never localized. Now, it was mentioned in the introduction that Square Enix chose to expand upon Final Fantasy Tactics. This happened in numerous ways, but perhaps the most intriguing expansion came via the release of Crystal Defenders, a tower defense game that served as a spin-off to Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift, which was first released as Crystal Guardians. In that game, players took command of well-known job units from the Tactics Advance series in order to defend their crystal at the end of a designated path. By utilizing music from Tactics A2 and with Ryoma Ito remaining in charge of character design, Crystal Defenders remained faithful to the aesthetic of the portable Ivalice games, but suffered due to the limitations of the mobile platforms it was released on. Nonetheless, despite there being a lukewarm reception, due to the boom of the tower defense genre at the time, Crystal Defenders ended up selling pretty well, and it led to Square Enix giving the green light for a sequel dubbed Crystal Defenders Vanguard Storm. Released a year after the original Crystal Defenders, Vanguard Storm took steps to switch up the tower defense formula, leaning on its heritage from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance to add RPG elements to the mix. Players took turns on opposite sides of a tile-based battlefield, using different job-based units to prevent monsters on the other side from encroaching on their territory. Each unit behaved differently, and the player had to move their units into place with each passing turn, a mechanic that separated Vanguard Storm out from other games in the genre releasing at that time. Vanguard Storm benefited from being released a year after the original game. Mobile technology had progressed significantly with the advent of the iPhone, and it was actually the first game Square Enix had designed specifically for touchscreen controls. Thanks to these changes in mechanics and the more colourful, personality-filled presentation, reviews of Vanguard Storm were more positive than its predecessor. But perhaps due to Crystal Defenders not being so well known, or the tower defense genre starting to fall out of favour in subsequent years, there ended up being no further continuation of the series. Crystal Chronicles was another sub-series similar to Ivalice that ended up getting a lot of expansion throughout the mid-2000s. Starting out on the GameCube in 2003, Crystal Chronicles carved out a niche of its own after seeing commercial success with its initial release, and this meant it spawned numerous spin-offs and sequels in the years to come. One of those was a game called Crystal Chronicles My Life as a King. Released in 2008 as a WiiWare downloadable title, narratively, My Life as a King was a direct sequel to the original Crystal Chronicles. It was set after the miasma covering the world of Crystal Chronicles had cleared and the land was beginning to be rebuilt. Players took control of Leo, a new king rebuilding his kingdom in a city builder style game, a very different type of genre to the original Crystal Chronicles. My Life as a King was pretty well received and sold fairly well for a downloadable title. This then led Square to release a sequel to My Life as a King. This game was called Crystal Chronicles My Life as a Dark Lord, and it too featured a different gameplay style to its predecessor. Releasing just 1 year after My Life as a King, Dark Lord gave the player a unique opportunity of opposing the protagonist of the world. You took on the role of Mia, who was the daughter of the defeated villain from Leo's adventure. She was then responsible for leading a campaign against the world that defeated her father. Similar to the Crystal Defenders games, Dark Lord was a tower defense game, and it employed a rock-paper-scissors style of tactics that players could utilize to gain the upper hand. By this point, however, the intrigue around Crystal Chronicles was really starting to fade, and there wasn't anywhere near as much fanfare about the release of Dark Lord as any of the previous games. It's perhaps for this reason that neither My Life as a King nor My Life as a Dark Lord have been released since their initial outings on the Wii, and Crystal Chronicles in general only saw one release after Dark Lord in Crystal Bearers. Crystal Chronicles was put back in the spotlight thanks to the 2020 remaster of the original game, but with that game plagued by numerous issues, it's likely that My Life as a Dark Lord will stay resigned to the annals of video game history. Nonograms, also known as picture crosswords or Picross games, have existed on games consoles as long as Final Fantasy has. Nintendo, in particular, has been using these puzzles to make pictures of their most beloved franchises like Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon, and they've been doing so since the days of the original Game Boy. Square Enix took quite a while to jump on this particular trend, as it wasn't until 2013 that a similar styled game was released via Piclogica Final Fantasy. Exclusive to Japanese mobile devices, Piclogica was a free-to-play live service game that used the iconography of the Final Fantasy franchise along with RPG mechanics to stand out against other games in the genre. This saw an element of Jeopardy added, as players would need to battle against iconic Final Fantasy foes by using smaller 5x5 grid-based Picross puzzles, and the quicker they solved, the more damage they do to their foe. 4 years after the release of Piclogica, a sequel was announced for the Nintendo 3DS named Piclogica Nearly Equal. This added over 300 traditional Picross puzzles with Final Fantasy themes, as well as the missions present in the mobile game. Way more characters were also added to this version, including the likes of Final Fantasy XV's Noctis, who was brand new at the time. And this brought the total number of characters in the game to over 160. Piclogica's collectible characters also carried a distinctive chibi art style to them, giving fans a chance to collect characters in a cute new way, including those who were rarely seen outside of their own games, like those from Final Fantasy Dimensions and even My Life as a Dark Lord. The original Piclogica was discontinued in 2019, not long after the release of Nearly Equal, making the 3DS version the only version still playable today. And fan-translated versions of the game are still floating around the internet for newcomers to enjoy. Many fans of Final Fantasy IV are aware of the After Years, the sequel that took place 17 years after the events of the original game. It starred Theodore, the son of Cecil Harvey and Rosa Farrell, as he banded together with characters new and old to learn the mystery of the returning Red Moon and his Lunarian heritage. The After Years was originally released in 2008 for Japanese mobile devices before being ported to the Nintendo Wii a year later. But as a new version of Final Fantasy IV was being produced for the PlayStation Portable, Square Enix saw fit to remake the After Years in a style that was in keeping with how they were remaking the base game. However, they also wanted to do something extra special for returning fans, and this saw the creation of a brand new game called Final Fantasy IV Interlude. Interlude was much shorter than either Final Fantasy IV or the After Years, and it was designed to bridge the gap between the two games. It therefore focused on the original party 1 year after the events of Final Fantasy IV, while introducing the new characters players would come to know in the After Years. Players saw Edward training his new secretary, Harley, witnessed the birth of Yang's daughter, Ursula, and began to see what would become of Rydia in the next story taking place 16 years later. Locations from the original Final Fantasy IV made up the entirety of Interlude, with players revisiting dungeons like the Sealed Cave, Mount Hobbs, and yet another visit to the Tower of Babel. Monsters were also either reused or reskinned versions of existing enemies, such as the Mum Bomb being renamed as the Dad Bomb. As it was designed to be part of the Final Fantasy IV Complete Collection, Interlude used the same combat mechanics as those seen in Final Fantasy IV, but it was a completely linear story and control of the airship was removed. Interestingly, even though the After Years then saw a full 3D remake, so it was consistent with the 3D remake of the base game, Interlude was not given the same treatment. So the only way to experience the game these days is via the Complete Collection, which was exclusive to the PlayStation Portable. In collaboration with the social network Gree, known in Japan for their mobile games and virtual goods, Square Enix released Final Fantasy Artnik in 2012. In Artnik, players collected cards depicting characters and equipment from across the Final Fantasy franchise, and they did this either through battling or through the in-game gacha system. The wider objective was then to battle monsters, level up, and eventually battle other players, and participate in limited time events pitting them against the likes of Kefka and Sephiroth. In a little over a month after its release, Final Fantasy Artnik reached 1 million registered players in Japan alone, prompting Square Enix to create a sequel to it. This sequel released in summer of 2014 and was called Final Fantasy Artnik Dive. Much like Final Fantasy Artnik before it, Artnik Dive was a free-to-play card-collecting gacha game released on the Greek platform for Japanese mobile devices. But it expanded on the mechanics of the original game by introducing a world map to explore, original characters, and the ability to craft weapons and summon monsters with collected materials. While Artnik Dive did use artwork of characters from the other Final Fantasy titles, it used them to augment the original characters of the game rather than using the cards themselves as the original game did. Similar to Artnik Dive was released really when Square Enix were finding their way in the mobile gacha gaming scene, and as such, it didn't really have the staying power of other games such as Record Keeper or Airborne Brigade, closing less than 2 years after its release in March 2016. However, Square Enix did use the knowledge gained from teaming up with other mobile developers to create more enhanced gacha games, which saw their popularity growing exponentially in Japan. and this saw them release Final Fantasy Brave Exvius alongside mobile developers Alim and Gumi in 2015, and that game continues to run to this day. That then brings us on to our final entry, which was exclusive to Japanese arcades, although some international arcades did import cabinets. Yes, we're talking about Theatrhythm Final Fantasy All-Star Carnival. The original Theatrhythm released on the Nintendo DS in 2012, and it became a much-loved title due to how it celebrated the music of the franchise. As a rhythm action game, Theatrhythm featured songs from across the franchise, and it depicted popular characters in a cute art style. In many ways, it created the ultimate Final Fantasy musical experience for fans, and 2 years later, its success brought about a sequel called Curtain Call. This introduced more characters, more songs, and new multiplayer options. And songs from other Square Enix properties were even included, such as The World Ends With You and Bravely Default. And Theatrhythm even started to become a brand of its own, with the release of Theatrhythm Dragon Quest in 2015. But the trip down memory lane did not stop there. After the release of Curtain Call, Square Enix decided they didn't want to continue the franchise in a traditional sense. They felt the Nintendo eShop would suffice, as additional songs could be added via downloadable content. However, when the opportunity to bring new games to Japanese arcades presented itself, it was decided that Theatrhythm was a natural fit, and thus, Theatrhythm Final Fantasy All-Star Carnival was born. As an arcade title, All-Star Carnival placed more emphasis on multiplayer than previous games. This came via enhanced competitive modes, but 2 players could even use the same cabinet, with each player taking control of half the cabinet to make songs easier than when tackled alone. All-Star Carnival was not necessarily designed to be an easier game than its 3DS predecessors though, and it introduced Transcendent difficulty as a blisteringly challenging level of play designed for the most hardcore of rhythm action fans. Not every song carried this difficulty, but those that did showcased the hardest challenge Theatrhythm could present, and those who finished the likes of Advent Children's One Winged Angel were heralded as rhythm action heroes. Sadly, All-Star Carnival was never officially released outside of Japan, though as mentioned, some arcades did still carry the cabinet for players outside of Japan. Thankfully, the rest of the world would still be able to experience all the songs made for All-Star Carnival when Theatrhythm Final Barline released last year. It brought forward most of the enhancements, including Transcendent difficulty, which was redubbed as Supreme. But with that, there were 7 lesser-known Final Fantasy sequels. Some of them you may have heard of, but we'd like to think there are a few snuck in there that didn't quite make it on your radar. Be sure to let us know in the comments below though how many of them you've played, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent, and Sukin TDK, or Super Special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.